Welcome to Craving the Heat, where desire takes the lead and every story leaves you wanting more. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments and keep up with our latest naughty stories. The rain had just begun when Isabella stepped out of her chauffeured car that evening, her heels clicking against the marble steps of the hotel where her father was hosting yet another lavish business dinner. She was used to these events, the flashing lights of luxury cars, the scent of expensive colognes, the fake laughter that echoed across grand halls. At 26, Isabella had grown up surrounded by wealth, her father being one of the city's most influential businessmen. She had the best education, the finest clothes, and a fiancé chosen for her, a polished young lawyer named Charles, who had all the right connections and none of the warmth she craved. As the driver pulled away, Isabella's eyes caught sight of someone sitting on the curb just across the street, drenched by the rain. His head was bowed, his clothes ragged, and a cardboard sign rested against his knees. For reasons she couldn't explain, Isabella felt her steps falter. Something inside her resisted the pull of the hotel doors. She hesitated, her heart beating faster, and then she crossed the street. "Are you okay?" she asked softly, her voice barely audible above the rain. The man looked up, and for a moment, Isabella froze. His eyes were startlingly clear, an ocean blue, that seemed to pierce through her polished exterior. "Just cold?" he murmured, his voice deep yet gentle. "But I'll be fine." She didn't believe him. There was something about him, something that didn't fit the image of a man defeated by life. He looked tired, yes, but there was dignity in the way he sat, as though he refused to bow entirely to his circumstances. "Come with me," she said before she could stop herself. "I'll get you something warm to eat." He hesitated, clearly embarrassed, but the hunger in his eyes betrayed him. After a pause, he nodded. She took him to a quiet cafe nearby, ignoring the stares as she ushered a homeless man through its glass doors. He introduced himself as Daniel, once a musician who had played in bars and small clubs until life unraveled after his mother's death and debts pulled him into ruin. Isabella listened intently as he spoke, her heart twisting with every detail. He wasn't asking for pity. He was telling his story with raw honesty, his voice steady, his eyes unflinching. Something about his openness struck her deeply. In him, she saw what she had been missing: authenticity. That night became the first of many. She found herself seeking Daniel out, sometimes bringing him food, sometimes just sitting with him and talking. Their conversations stretched into hours. He would tease her for her expensive dresses, and she would laugh at his stubborn pride. Slowly, the polished world Isabella had always known began to feel hollow compared to the quiet moments she shared with him. Her fiancé Charles noticed the change. He was used to Isabella being compliant, perfect, the ideal partner for a man of his status, but she was distracted now, distant. When he confronted her, she brushed it off with excuses. Yet deep inside, Isabella knew what was happening. She was falling in love with someone she could never bring home, someone society would never accept. The first time they crossed that invisible line, it was raining again. Isabella had found Daniel shivering in an alley, his hands raw from the cold. Without thinking, she pulled him into her car and drove him to her family's lake house, a place she rarely visited. They lit a fire, and as the flames flickered, he whispered, "You shouldn't be here with me." But Isabella stepped closer, her eyes glistening. "You're the only place I want to be." Their kiss was hesitant at first, then urgent, desperate, as though years of loneliness and longing collided in that one moment. Isabella had never known passion like this, not with Charles, not with anyone. Every touch from Daniel was unpolished. Real, alive. Days turned into weeks. They stole time together, secret rendezvous in quiet places, whispered conversations in the shadows, stolen touches that burned with forbidden fire. But with every passing day, the risk grew heavier. Charles grew suspicious. Her father would disown her if he knew. The media would tear her apart, and yet Isabella couldn't stop. Daniel became the one truth in her carefully constructed life. of lies, but secrets, no matter how beautiful, never stay hidden forever. One night, after another argument with Charles, Isabella fled to Daniel, tears streaking her face. She poured out everything, the pressure, the engagement she never wanted, the life that wasn't hers. Daniel held her close, his own heart breaking. "You deserve freedom, Isabella," he whispered. "But I can't be the reason you lose everything." "You already are," she replied, her voice trembling. "And I don't care." For the first time in her life, Isabella chose with her heart instead of her obligations. The scandal that followed was brutal. Her engagement shattered, her father's rage unrelenting, the tabloids ruthless. But through it all, Daniel stood beside her, never asking for more than her love, never wavering in his quiet strength. What began as an act of kindness on a rainy street became the greatest love of her life. It was messy, forbidden, and born out of betrayal, but it was real. And for Isabella, that was beautiful enough. The days after Isabella's choice felt both terrifying and liberating. She had walked away from everything her family expected of. Her wealth, respect, social standing, even her marriage arrangement to Charles. The house was filled with the echo of her father's silence, the kind that hurt more than shouting. Her mother tried to intervene gently, urging her to reconsider, reminding her of the life she was throwing away. But Isabella had already tasted something she could never go back from. Truth. Daniel was living in a small rented room now, one Isabella had insisted on helping him pay for. At first, his pride resisted, but he knew she was right. He needed stability if he wanted to rebuild his life. He picked up work where he could, odd jobs that kept his hands busy and his mind hopeful. Isabella visited whenever she could, slipping away from the suffocating grip of her family to the tiny room with the creaking floorboards and peeling wallpaper. For her, it wasn't the space that mattered, it was him. In that small world. They built something entirely their own. They cooked simple meals together, laughed about things nobody else would understand, and talked late into the night about dreams, fears, and futures that felt impossible yet tempting. Daniel would sometimes play his old guitar, the strings worn but still carrying melodies that filled the room with warmth. Isabella would sit cross-legged on the bed, watching him, her heart swelling with something deeper than passion. It was devotion, but life wasn't kind to them. Outside those walls, whispers spread. Her father's associates spoke behind closed doors about the shame she had brought upon the family. Charles wasn't silent either. He made sure everyone in their circle knew Isabella had humiliated him, and in a world where reputation was currency, her name was now worth less than nothing. Invitations stopped coming. Old friends avoided her. Even strangers she passed on the street looked twice, their curiosity sharp as knives. There were nights when the weight of it all broke her. She would cry in Daniel's arms, telling him she missed her mother's voice, the security of her old life, the illusion of belonging. And Daniel, though he carried his own burdens, never let her drown. He would remind her softly, "You left because your heart wanted something real. That's worth more than anything they can take away." Yet Daniel himself wasn't untouched by doubt. Sometimes he feared he was dragging her down into a life she didn't deserve. He was haunted by the thought that one day she would wake up, tired of peeling paint and secondhand clothes, and realize she had given up everything for nothing. One evening, after a particularly long day of hauling boxes at a warehouse job, he looked at her as she stirred soup on the tiny stove and said, "You could still walk away, Isabella. You could go back. They'd forgive you eventually. You don't have to stay here with me." She turned slowly, her eyes glistening but firm. "Don't you understand? I never felt alive until you. I don't care where we live, Daniel. I care that when you touch me, I feel seen. I care that when you look at me, I'm not just my father's daughter or Charles's fiancée, I'm me." Her words silenced him, but deep down they terrified him too. To be loved so completely meant he had something precious to lose. Love was passionate, yes, but it wasn't only passion that bound them, it was the little things. The way he would brush her hair back when she was reading, The way she would patch the holes in his shirts, the way they learned to share silence without needing to fill it. Their nights often ended wrapped in each other's arms, the world outside. Irrelevant. In those moments, Isabella didn't see a man who had lost everything. She saw the man who had given her everything she'd been missing. Still, reality pressed against the fragile world they had made. One afternoon, Isabella's father arrived at Daniel's room unannounced. His expensive suit looked out of place against the crumbling hallway, but his voice carried the weight of power. He offered Daniel money, a fresh start, a way out, but only if he left Isabella for good. Daniel listened, his jaw tight, his pride screaming. When he refused, Isabella's father spat words like daggers, accusing him of using her, of being nothing more than a parasite feeding on her rebellion. When Isabella found out, she was furious not at Daniel, but at her father. She stormed into her parents' home, demanding to be treated as someone capable of making her own choices. Her father's cold reply was, "You've made your choice already, Isabella, and it wasn't us." It hurt more than she could admit, but that night when she collapsed into Daniel's arms, she knew she had crossed a bridge she could never return from. Their journey wasn't easy. There were weeks when money was scarce, when meals were nothing. The bread and tea when Daniel's hands ached from endless labor. Yet, in those hardships, Isabella found a happiness she had never known in her golden cage. She began working quietly too, teaching music lessons to children in a small community center. Watching her laugh with those kids, Daniel realized she had never belonged to the world of chandeliers and business dinners. She belonged here in a life built not on appearances but on love, and slowly, piece by piece, Daniel rebuilt his music. He began playing at local bars again, Isabella always in the crowd, her eyes shining with pride. He wasn't famous, he wasn't rich, but when his songs filled the air, people listened. And when Isabella looked at him, he felt whole again. Theirs was a love born out of an act of compassion, tested in fire, shaped by betrayal and sacrifice. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't easy, but it was theirs. And when Isabella thought of that night in the rain when she had first crossed the street to a man shivering in the storm, she realized it hadn't just been his life she had changed, it had been her own. Years slipped by, and with them the sharp edges of scandal dulled, though they never disappeared completely. Isabella and Daniel had carved a life together, one far from the glittering world she once belonged to. Their apartment changed over time, moving from a single cramped room with cracked ceilings to a modest home tucked in a quieter neighborhood, where ivy climbed the walls and children's laughter carried from the nearby park dot. The love they shared deepened with the years. Their struggles had given them a kind of intimacy money could never buy. They had endured hunger, whispers, and the crushing weight of disapproval, and yet every hardship only tied them closer. Isabella often thought about how, in her old life, love had been a word tossed about at dinner tables and in drawing rooms, but never truly felt. With Daniel, it was in every gesture, every look, every silence shared between them. But the world she left behind had not vanished. Her father grew older, and illness softened him in ways she never expected. When news reached her that he had collapsed, Isabella found herself standing once again before the iron gates of her family's estate. Daniel urged her to go, reminding her that love wasn't about walls or pride, it was about showing up when it mattered most. And so, trembling, she walked back into the house she had once fled, uncertain of how she would be received. Her father was thinner, his eyes no longer fierce but tired. For a long time, he just stared at her as if unsure whether she was a dream. Then, with a voice cracked from both age and regret, he said, "You never stopped being my daughter. I just didn't know how to forgive you or myself." Tears filled Isabella's eyes as she knelt beside him, her hand finding his. Years of distance melted in that moment, though the scars of the past still remained. Daniel stayed away at first, not wanting to intrude, but Isabella insisted on bringing him. The day her father met him again, there was tension, yes, but also something else: acceptance. He no longer saw a man who had stolen his daughter, but one who had kept her safe when he could not. Though there were no grand apologies, no sweeping reconciliations, there was a quiet understanding that maybe time had softened even the harshest judgments. Life moved forward. Isabella continued teaching music, pouring herself into the joy of helping children find their voices. Daniel's music found a place too, not on the world's largest stages, but in the hearts of those who came to hear him in small cafes, festivals, and community gatherings. They weren't rich, not in the way Isabella's family once defined it, but their lives were full. Their home was a place of warmth, the kind of warmth that came from nights spent cooking together, mornings filled with sunlight and shared coffee, and afternoons when they simply sat in silence, content in each other's presence. There were still moments of doubt, of course. There were days when Isabella missed her mother's embrace or the security of her old life. And there were nights when Daniel worried that one day the weight of sacrifice might catch up to her. But every time those shadows crept in, they found their way back to each other. A soft kiss, a whispered reassurance, or simply the comfort of lying together in bed, feeling the steady rhythm of their hearts. These things anchored them in ways wealth or reputation never could. Years later, as Isabella watched Daniel play for a crowd of young musicians he mentored, she realized something profound. What they had built wasn't just love, it was legacy. It was proof that love born and rain-soaked nights and tested by fire could survive, grow, and even flourish. Her old world had tried to define her, to confine her, but in choosing Daniel, she had chosen herself. And in that choice, she had found a kind of freedom and happiness that no amount of approval or wealth could ever match. One evening, sitting together on their porch as the sky turned shades of gold and violet, Daniel squeezed her hand and said, "Do you ever regret it, Isabella? Walking away from all of that?" She leaned her head against his shoulder, her smile soft. "I don't regret a single step, because every one of them led me here with you." And in that quiet moment, with the world hushed around them and their hearts beating in sync, they knew they had already lived the kind of love story most people only dream of. The years passed quietly. And though the world around them changed, Isabella and Daniel's bond remained steady. Their love, born out of turmoil and scandal, had grown into something that was no longer fragile or desperate. It was rooted, unshakable, like the ivy that now covered the walls of their home. Daniel's hair turned silver faster than Isabella's, but she loved him all the more for it. She said the streaks reminded her of the nights they had stayed up until dawn, whispering about dreams they thought they might never reach. His hands grew rougher, slower at times, but when they touched hers, the warmth was always the same. Isabella, too, had lines around her eyes, but they came from years of smiling at him across crowded rooms and laughing at jokes only they understood. They never had children of their own, though not for lack of wishing. When the years made that dream impossible, they opened their home to others instead. Stray souls, neighbors, children who needed guidance, students who had no place to go, even the occasional musician trying to find his way passed through. Their doors, each one carried a piece of Isabella and Daniel's love with them when they left, as though the couple had woven their story into every life they touched. Their small house became something of a sanctuary, a place for kindness, and music lingered in the air like incense. Isabella's father passed quietly one spring morning. She stood at his bedside, Daniel beside her, when his breathing finally slowed to nothing. The grief surprised her not because it came, but because it was softened by peace. She no longer carried the sharp edge of rebellion in her chest. Instead, she felt only gratitude that they had found each other again before it was too late. Daniel held her through the funeral, his hand never once leaving hers, even when eyes turned their way. She realized then that the disapproval of others no longer mattered. Life had already proven to her where her place was, at his side. As they grew older, their love shifted in subtle ways. The fire of their early passion never disappeared, but it mellowed, becoming something deeper, more tender. There were mornings when Isabella would wake to find Daniel already in the kitchen, humming to himself as he made coffee. She would pause at the doorway, watching him, her heart still fluttering the same way it had when she first saw him strumming his guitar in the rain all those years ago. Daniel often teased her for reading too much, but in truth, he loved seeing her curled up with a book, sunlight catching her hair. He would sit beside her, guitar in hand, playing softly while she lost herself in her pages. They didn't need to speak much. Silence between them was never empty. It was full of the life they had built, a quiet testament to all they had endured. On their 20th anniversary, Daniel surprised Isabella with a small gathering. Friends, students, neighbors, even some of her estranged family came together in their garden, which had been lit with strings of warm golden lights. He played a song he had written for her, his voice unsteady but rich with emotion. Tears spilled down her cheeks as he sang about the girl in the rain who had given him her heart, and the woman she'd become who still carried it. That night, as they danced under the stars, Isabella whispered in his ear that she would choose him again, every single time. Even knowing the pain it had once caused Dot as the years stretched further, they faced sickness and frailty, as all couples do. Daniel's hands, once strong on the guitar, began to tremble. Isabella's steps grew slower, her breath shallower on cold mornings. And yet, when one faltered, the other was there to steady. Love became less about words and more about presence, a blanket tucked around cold shoulders, a cup of tea left. On the bedside table, the familiar weight of a hand in the dark of night. One autumn, when the leaves burned in colors of gold and crimson, Isabella fell ill. The doctors spoke gently, their words carrying the weight of inevitability. Daniel stayed by her side every moment, refusing to let her face a single hour alone. He read her favorite books aloud, his voice cracked with age but still filled with devotion. He played her old songs on the guitar, even when his fingers stumbled over the strings. She often smiled at him through her pain, whispering that he was still her music, still her home Dot in her final days. Isabella looked at him and said, "Do you remember the night in the rain? When everything changed?" Daniel nodded, his eyes glistening. "That was the night my life began," she said. "And every moment since has been worth it." When she was gone, Daniel felt as though the world had dimmed. But even in his grief, he carried her with him. He continued to teach young musicians, passing along not just melodies, but lessons of love, courage, and sacrifice. And every evening, he sat on the porch where they had once watched the sun set together, humming the song he had written for her, knowing that somewhere beyond the reach of time, she was listening. Love had started for them in scandal, tested by hardship and shaped by sacrifice. But in the end, it endured beyond death itself, leaving behind a story not of shame, but of beauty, a reminder that sometimes the most forbidden beginnings can become the purest of endings.